चलो जो मोदी बेटे स्टार्ट करना काम नहीं चलो मैं पढ़ा चलो चलो إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا علي يا عظيم يا غفور يا رحيم أنت الرب العظيم الذي ليس كمثله شيء وهو السميع البصير وهذا شهر عظمته وكرمته وشرفته وفضلته على الشهور وهو شهر الذي فرضت صيامه عليه وهو شهر رمضان الذي أنزلت فيه القرآن هدى للناس وبينات من الهدى والفرقان وجعلت فيه ليلة القدر وجعلتها خيرا من 1000 شهر فيا ذا المن ولا يمن عليك من علي بفقاك ركبتي من النار في من تمن علي وأدخل الجنة برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم رب شهر رمضان الذي أنزلت فيه القرآن وافترست إلى عبادك فيه الصيام صل على محمد وآل محمد وارزقني حج بيتك الحرام في عامي هذا وفي كل عام واغفر تلك ذنوب العظام فإنه لا يغفر غيرك يا رحمن يا علام اللهم صل على محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم إني أفتتح الثناء بحمدك وأنت مسدد للصواب بمنك وأيقنت أنك أنت أرحم الراحمين في موضع العفو والرحمة وأشد المعاقبين في موضع النقال والنقمة وأعظم المتجبرين في موضع الكبرياء والعظمة اللهم أذنت لي في دعائك ومسألتك فاسمع يا سميع مدحتي واجب يا رحيم دعوتي وقل يا غفور أثرتي فكم يا إلهي من كربة قد فرجتها وهموم قد كشفتها وأسة قد أقلتها ورحمة قد نشرتها وهلكة بلاء قد فكبتها الحمد لله الذي لم يتخذ صاحبة ولا ولدا ولم يكن له شريك في الملك ولم يكن له ولي من الذل وكبره تكبيرا الحمد لله بجميع محامده كلها على جميع نعمه كلها الحمد لله الذي لا مضاد له في ملكه ولا منازع له في أمره. الحمد لله الذي لا شريك له في خلقه ولا شبيه له في عظمته. الحمد لله الفاشي في الخلق أمره وحمده، الظاهر بالكرم مجده، الباسط بالجود يده، الذي لا تنقص خزائنه ولا تزيد كثرة العطاء إلا جودا وكرما، إنه هو العزيز الوهاب. اللهم إني أسألك قليلا من كثير مع حاجة بي إليه عظيما، وغناك عنه قديم وهو عندي كثير وهو عليك سهل يسير. اللهم إن عفوك عن ذنبي وتجاوزك عن خطيئتي وسفحك عن ظلمي وسترك على كبيه أملي وحلمك عن كثير جرمي، عندما كان من خطئي وأمدي أطمعني في أن أسألك ما لا أستوجبه من الذي رزقتني من رحمتك وأريتني من قدرتك وعرفتني من إجابتك، فسرت أدعوك آمنا وأسألك مستأنسا لا خائفا ولا وجلا مذلا عليك فيما كسدت فيه لك، فإن أبت عني أتبت بجهلي عليك، ولعل الذي أبت عني هو خير لي لعلمك عاقبة الأمور. فلم أر مولا كريما أصبر على عبد اللعين منك علي يا رب، إنك تدعوني فأولي وتتحبب إلي فتبغض إليك وتتودد إلي فلا أقبل منك أني لتطول عليك. فلم يمنع ذلك من رحمة والإحسان عليك وتفاضلي علي بجود كرمك، وارحم عبدك الجاهل وجد عليه بفضل إحسانك، إنك جواد كريم. الحمد لله مالك الملك مجري الفلك مسخر الرياح فالق الإصباح ديان دين رب العالمين. الحمد لله على علمه بعد علمه، والحمد لله على عفو بعد قدرته، والحمد لله على طول أناته في غضبه وهو قادر على ما يريد. الحمد لله خالق الخلق باسط الرزق فالق الإسباح ذي الجلال والإكرام والفضل والإنعام، الذي بعد فلا يرى وقرب فشهد النجوى تبارك وتعالى. الحمد لله الذي ليس له مناد يعادله ولا شبيه يشاكله ولا ذري يعازله، قهر بعزة العزة وتواضع لعظمة العظماء فبلغ بقدرته ما يشاء. الحمد لله الذي يجيبني حين أنادي ويستر علي كل عورة وأنا أعصي ويعزم النعمة علي فلا أجازي. فكم من موهبة هنية قد أعطاني وعزيمة مخوفة قد كفاني وبهجة مونكة قد أراني وأثني إليه حامدا وأشكره مسبحا. الحمد لله الذي لا يفتح حجابه ولا يغلق بابه ولا يرد سائله ولا يخيب آمله. الحمد لله الذي يؤمن الخائفين وينجي الصالحين ويرفع المستعزفين ويذل المستكبرين ويخلق الملوك ويستخلف آخرين. والحمد لله قاسم الجبارين مبين الظالمين مدرك الهاربين نكال الظالمين شريخ المستشرقين موعود حاجات الطالبين معتمد المؤمنين. الحمد لله من خشية تعود السماء وسكانها وترجف الأرض أمارها وتموج البحار ومن يسلو في غمراتها. الحمد لله هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. الحمد لله الذي يخلق ولم يخلق ويرزق ولا يرزق ويطعم ولا يطعم ويميت الأحياء ويحيي الموتى وهو حي لا يموت بيده الخير وهو على كل شيء قدير. اللهم صل على محمد عبدك ورسولك وأمينك وسفيك وحبيبك وخيرتك من خلقك وحافظ سرك وبلغ صلاتك أفضل وأحسن وأجمل وأكمل وأزكى وأنمى وأطيب وأطهر وأسنى وأكثر ما صليت وباركت وترحمت وتحننت وسلمت على أحد من عبادك وأنبيائك ورسولك وصفة أهل الكرامة عليك من خلقك. اللهم وصل على علي أمير المؤمنين ووصي رسول رب العالمين عبدك ووليك وأخي رسولك وحجتك على خلقك وآيتك الكبرى والنبي العظيم. وصل على الصديقة الطاهرة فاطمة سيد نساء العالمين. وصل على سبطي الرحمة وإمامي الهدى الحسن والحسين سيدي شباب أهل الجنة. وصل على أئمة المسلمين علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والخلفاء هادي المهدي. وجزك على عبادك وملائكة في بلادك صلاة كثيرة دائمة. اللهم وصل على ولي أمرك القائم المعمل والعدل المنتظر وحفه بملائكتك المقربين وأيده بروح القدس يا رب العالمين. اللهم اجعل الداعي إلى كتابك والقائم بدينك استخلف في الأرض كما استخلفت الذي من قبله مكن له دينه الذي ارتضيت له أبدله من بعد خوفه أمنا يعبدك لا يشرك بك شيئا. اللهم أعزه وأعزز به وانصره وانتصر به وانصره نصرا عزيزا وافتح له فتحا يسيرا واجعل له من لدنك سلطانا نصيرا. اللهم أزهر به دينك دينك وسنة نبيك حتى لا يستغفر بشيء من الحق مخافة أحد من الخلق. اللهم إنا نرغب إليك في دولة كريمة تعز بها الإسلام وأهله وتذل بها النفاق وأهله وتجعلنا فيها من الدعاة إلى طاعتك والقادة إلى سبيلك وترزقنا بها كرامة الدنيا والآخرة. اللهم ما عرفتنا من الحق فحملنا وما كسرنا عنه فبلغنا. اللهم العن به شعثنا واشعب به صدعنا واتق به فتكنا وكسر به كلتنا وعزز به ذلتنا واغن به آئلنا واغز به عن مغرمنا واجبر به فقرنا وسد به قلتنا ويسر به أسرنا وبيز به وجوهنا وفك به أسرنا وانجح به طلبتنا وانجز به معايدنا واستجب به دعوتنا واعتنا به سؤلنا وبلغنا به من الدنيا والآخرة آمالنا واعتنا به فوق رغبتنا يا خير المسؤولين وأوسع المعطين. اشف به صدورنا واذهب به غيظ قلوبنا واهدنا به لما اختلف فيه من الحق بإذنك إنك تهدي من تشاء إلى صراط مستقيم وانصرنا به على عدوك وعدونا إلى الحق آمين. اللهم إنا نشكو إليك فقد نبينا صلواتك عليه وآله وغيبة ولينا وكسر عدونا وقلة عددنا وشدة الفتن بنا وتظاهر الزمان علينا. فصل على محمد وآله وعنا على ذلك بفتح منك تؤجله وبزور تكشفه ونصر تعزه وسلطان حق تظهره ورحمة منك تجلناها وعافية منك تلبسناها برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم برحمتك في الصالحين فأدخلنا وفي عليين فارفعنا وبكأس من معين من عين سلسبيل فاسقنا ومن الحور العين برحمتك فزوجنا ومن الولدان المخلدين كأنهم لؤلؤ مكنون فأكزمنا ومن ثمار الجنة ولحوم الطير فأطعمنا ومن ثياب السندس والحرير والاستبرق فالبسنا وليلة القدر وحج بيتك الحرام وقتلا في سبيلك فوفق لنا وصالح الدعاء ومسألة فاستجب لنا. وإذا جمعت الأولين والآخرين يوم القيامة فارحمنا وبراءة من النار فاكتب لنا وفي جهنم فلا تغلنا وفي عذابك فوانك فلا تبدلنا ومن الزقوم والزريع فلا تدعمنا ومع الشياطين فلا تدعلنا وفي النار على وجوهنا فلا تكببنا ومن ثياب النار وسراب القطران فلا تلبسنا من كل سوء يا لا إله إلا أنت بحق لا إله إلا أنت فنجنا. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم إني أسألك أن تجعل فيما تقضي وتقدر من الأمر المحتوم الحكوم في الأمر الحكيم من القضاء الذي لا يرد ولا يبدل أن تكتبني من حجاج بيتك الحرام المبرور حجهم المشكور سعيهم المغفور ذنوبهم المكفر عن سيئاتهم، وأن تجعل فيما تقضي وتقدر أن تطيل عمري في خير وعافية وتوسع في رزقي وتجعلني ممن تنتصر به لدينك ولا تستبدل بي غيري. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أعوذ بجلال وجهك الكريم أن ينقضي عني شهر رمضان، أن يطلع الفجر من ليلة هذه، ولقد قبلت أبيض أو ذنب تعذبني عليه. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا ذا الذي كان قبل كل شيء ثم قبل كل شيء ثم يبقى ويفنى كل شيء، يا ذا الذي ليس كمثله شيء، ويا ذا الذي ليس في السماوات العلى ولا في الأرضين السفلى ولا فوقهن ولا تحتهن ولا بينهن إله يعبد غيره، لك الحمد حمدا لا يقوى على إحصائه إلا أنت. فصل على محمد وآل محمد صلاة لا يقوى على إحصائها إلا أنت. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إلهي وكفى السائلون ببابك ولا زال الفقراء بجنابك، ووقفت سفينة المساكين على ساحة بحر جودك وكرمك يرجون الجواز إلى ساحة رحمتك ونعمتك. إلهي إن كنت لا ترحم في هذا الشهر الشريف إلا من أخلص لك في صيامه وقيامه، فمن للمذنب المقصر إذا غرق في بحر ذنوبه وآثامه. إلهي إن كنت لا ترحم إلا المطيعين فمن للعاصين، وإن كنت لا تقل إلا بالعاملين فمن للمقصرين. إلهي ربح الصائمون وفاز القائمون ونجا المخلصون، ونحن عبيدك المذنبون، فارحمنا برحمتك واعتقنا من النار بعفوك، واغفر لنا ذنوبنا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم ادخل على أهل القبور السرور، اللهم اغن كل فقير، اللهم اشبع كل جائع، اللهم اقص كل عريان، اللهم اقص دين كل مدين، اللهم فرج عن كل مكروه، اللهم رد كل غريب، اللهم فك كل أسير، اللهم أصلح كل فاسد من أمور المسلمين، اللهم اشف كل مريض، اللهم سد فقرنا بغناك، اللهم غير سوء حالنا بحسن حالك، اللهم اجز عنا الدين واغننا من الفقر، إنك على كل شيء قدير.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم إنك قلت في كتابك المنزل: شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن هدى للناس وبينات من الهدى والفرقان، فعظمت حرمة شهر رمضان بما أنزلت فيه من القرآن، وخصصته بليلة القدر وجعلتها خيرا من 1000 شهر. اللهم وهذه أيام شهر رمضان قد انقضت ولياليه قد تصرمت، وقد سرت يا إلهي منه إلى ما أنت أعلم به مني وأحصى لعدده من الخلق أجمعين، فأسألك بما سألك به ملائكتك المقربون وأنبياؤك المرسلون وعبادك الصالحون أن تصلي على محمد وآل محمد، وأن تفك ركبتي من النار وتدخلني الجنة برحمتك، وأن تتفضل علي بعفوك وكرمك وتتقبل تقر بي وتستجيب دعائي، وتمن علي بالأمن يوم الخوف من كل هول أعددته ليوم القيامة. إلهي وأعوذ بوجهك الكريم وبجلالك العظيم أن تنقضي أيام شهر رمضان ولياليه ولك قبلي تبعة أو ذنب تؤاخذني به أو خطيئة تريد أن تقتصها مني لم تغفرها لي. سيدي 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 أسألك يا لا إله إلا أنت، إذ لا إله إلا أنت، إن كنت رضيت عني في هذا الشهر فازدد عني رضا، وإن لم تكن رزيت عني فمن الآن فارض عني يا أرحم الراحمين. يا الله يا أحد يا صمد، يا من لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا ملين الحديد لداود عليه السلام، يا كاشف الضر والكرب العظام عن أيوب عليه السلام، أي مفرج هم يعقوب عليه السلام، أي منفذ هم يوسف عليه السلام. صل على محمد وآل محمد كما أنت أهله أن تصلي عليهم أجمعين، وافعل بي ما أنت أهله ولا تفعل بي ما أنا أهله. يا ملين الحديد لداود عليه السلام، يا كاشف الضر والكرب العظام عن أيوب عليه السلام، أي مفرج هم يعقوب عليه السلام، أي منفذ هم يوسف عليه السلام. صل على محمد وآل محمد كما أنت أهله أن تصلي عليهم أجمعين، وافعل بي ما أنت أهله ولا تفعل بي ما أنا أهله. يا ملين الحديد لداود عليه السلام، يا كاشف الضر والكرب العظام عن أيوب عليه السلام، أي مفرج هم يعقوب عليه السلام، أي منفذ هم يوسف عليه السلام. صل على محمد وآل محمد كما أنت أهله أن تصلي عليهم أجمعين، وافعل بي ما أنت أهله ولا تفعل بي ما أنا أهله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا الله يا الله يا الله، يا رحمن يا الله، يا رحيم يا الله، يا ملك يا الله، يا قدوس يا الله، يا سلام يا الله، يا مؤمن يا الله، يا مهيمن يا الله، يا عزيز يا الله، يا جبار يا الله، يا متكبر يا الله، يا خالق يا الله، يا بارئ يا الله، يا مصور يا الله، يا عالم يا الله، يا عظيم يا الله، يا عليم يا الله، يا كريم يا الله، حليم يا الله، يا حكيم يا الله، يا سميع يا الله، يا بصير يا الله، يا قريب يا الله، يا مجيب يا الله، يا جواد يا الله، يا ماجد يا الله، يا مني يا الله، يا وفي يا الله، يا مولى يا الله، يا قاضي يا الله، يا سريع يا الله، يا شديد يا الله، يا رؤوف يا الله، يا رقيب يا الله، يا مجيد يا الله، يا حفيظ يا الله، يا محيط يا الله، يا سيد السادات يا الله، يا أول يا الله، يا آخر يا الله، يا ظاهر يا الله، يا باطن يا الله، يا فاخر يا الله، يا قاهر يا الله، يا رباه يا الله، يا رباه يا الله، يا رباه يا الله، يا ودود يا الله، يا نور يا الله، يا رافع يا الله، يا مانع يا الله، يا دافع يا الله، يا فاتح يا الله، يا نفاح يا الله، يا جليل يا الله، يا جميل يا الله، يا شديد يا الله، يا شاهد يا الله، يا مغيث يا الله، يا حبيب يا الله، يا فاطر يا الله، يا مطهر يا الله، يا ملك يا الله، يا مقتدر يا الله، يا قابض يا الله، يا باسط يا الله، يا محيي يا الله، يا مميت يا الله، يا باعث يا الله، يا وارث يا الله، يا معطي يا الله، يا مفضل يا الله، يا منعم يا الله، يا حق يا الله، يا مبين يا الله، يا طيب يا الله، يا محسن يا الله، يا مجمل يا الله، يا مبدئ يا الله، يا معيد يا الله، يا بارئ يا الله، يا بديع يا الله، يا هادي يا الله، يا كافي يا الله، يا شافي يا الله، يا علي يا الله، يا عظيم يا الله، يا حنان يا الله، يا منان يا الله، يا ذا الطول يا الله، يا متعالي يا الله، يا عدل يا الله، يا ذا المعارج يا الله، يا صادق يا الله، يا صدوق يا الله، يا ديان يا الله، يا باقي يا الله، يا واقي يا الله، يا ذا الجلال يا الله، يا ذا الإكرام يا الله، يا محمود يا الله، يا معبود يا الله، يا صالح يا الله، يا معين يا الله، يا مكون يا الله، يا فعال يا الله، يا لطيف يا الله، يا غفور يا الله، يا شكور يا الله، يا نور يا الله، يا قدير يا الله، يا رباه 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 أسألك أن تصلي على محمد وآل محمد وتمن علي برضاك وتعفو عني بحلمك وتوسع علي من رزقك الحلال الطيب ومن حيث أحتسب ومن حيث لا أحتسب فإني عبدك ليس لي أحد سواك ولا أحد أسأله غيرك يا أرحم الراحمين. ما شاء الله لا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم.
May please recite Surah Fatiha for the Mu'min of the family sponsors to the Junaid
Hello, hello. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We have some refreshments over here. We are taking a 5-6 minutes break. So if you would like to have some chai or some refreshments, please feel free to. We'll start in next 2-3 minutes, inshallah. Par Muhammad wa ali Muhammad salawat.
One, two, three, mic test.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما
One, two, three, one, two, three.
محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجه. At the onset, I would like to, on behalf of the management of ICON, the Board of Trustees, the volunteers, we would like to thank the community for their generous support. Alhamdulillah. Ramadan has been very spiritual. We have had good nights and good programs at ICON, and the level of support you can imagine that right before Ramadan, even before Ramadan has had started, we had almost booked all the iftar sponsors. So for that, Alhamdulillah, we would like to thank the entire community for their generous support. Without any further delays, I would like to. Okay, so Dr. Shabir Kirmani, mashallah, he is well known in our community, especially in the younger generation, the youth, and does not need any introduction. But I would like to, because when I read his biography, I was myself very impressed. And for those who do not really know what Dr. Kirmani is and what's his background, I would like to read out loud to you guys. Ma salawat, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil. I felt so proud after reading this. So I'm going to read it like as it is. Dr. Shabir Kirmani is a poet, is a researcher and lecturer in American Muslim community. An engineer by training, Dr. Kirmani has a diverse professional background, working with Fortune 500 firms in sectors as diverse as pharmaceuticals, government, and consulting. As a lecturer, he has traveled throughout North America, Europe, Asia, Australia to lecture for past 15 years, mashallah. Additionally, he has been an active speaker in multiple conferences and seminars in the US, Canada, UK, and seminars in the US on topics as diverse as Islam and economics, modernity and development. He lectures in both the English and Urdu as medium languages. He was co-founder of the Ahlul Bayt Society of UCF and served as president and vice president of the society, alhamdulillah. Born and raised in Maryland by the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., Sayyid is passionate about Islam in America, particularly the present and future of the American Muslim community, and works to bridge the gap between modernity and religion. That's the beauty about it. He completed his bachelor's degree, a little bit of his academic background. He completed his bachelor's degree in economics, mathematics, and computer sciences in 2012. His master's is in engineering in 2015 and his PhD in 2021 in the same field of industrial engineering, mashallah. He has been and continues to pursue his studies at Imam Sadiq, Bar Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He has been and continues to pursue his studies at the Imam Sadiq Seminary and the International Islamic School of Theology. Sayyid enjoys good books, thought-provoking discussions, volunteering, and traveling. And for that, I myself is a witness, because that's, mashallah, his beauty, that whenever he speaks, he would refer to different quotes and different sayings of well-known authorities on the subject. Dr. Karmani currently serves as the resident scholar at Masjid Al-Hayy in Orlando, Florida. Besides his background, he's a thorough gentleman, alhamdulillah, and today he's here to share his thoughts on pursuits of Kamal, Islam and excellence in the 21st century. Dr. Karmani is going to have a short talk, which is going to be followed by an interactive question and answer sessions. So, Mu'mineen, ladies and gents, please feel free to ask if you have any questions, and he's going to invite himself. And we would like to have this session as engaging as possible, so that we can benefit as much as possible. And with that, I'm not going to be, in the middle of this podium and Dr. Karmani. We would like to welcome Dr. Shabir Kirmani to share his thoughts with us. Bar Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad salawat. Allah salli ala. Thank you.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على رسوله الكريم وعلى أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. It's post-iftar, right? So a couple of really quick points I'm going to share with you guys, inshallah, and hopefully we can open up to questions and some discussion, and I hope to learn from you as much as I learn from here. The first concept being the motivation behind this conversation as to why this is an important conversation, the pursuit of Kamal, what is Kamal, and what is the relationship, if any, between Islam and excellence in the modern world. So the few things that I want to lay out before you is why this topic, why is it so pertinent, what led me on this pursuit, and what does it have to do with all of us, and how can we apply to this? There's a bit of an echo. Can we get rid of the echo if it's not too much trouble, inshallah? Or are you guys able to hear me? Are you able to get me clearly? Okay, as long as you can get me, that's fine. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says very clearly, إِنَّ الدِّينَ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ الْإِسْلَامِ. So a few tools that we can learn are صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Okay. So two things. I was reading a book. There's a book and a conference that's held every year in Iran. So the motivation about the solution. The problem's in front of you. If the status quo continues, there's an eventual 4-generation dilution that happens. And I'll be honest with you, I grew up with my friends and most of them, they've lost a lot. I mean, they're not participating. Not that they're not religious, by the way. They may be very practicing, but they're not getting added value from the centers in the communities, which is a different conversation. Solution-wise, Sayyid Khamenei has a book, and I invite you to read on it. It's a talks that he's given at conferences that have been compiled into a book. And he talks about a guy named Iqbal. Iqbal, who is known as Allama Iqbal in the Indian subcontinent, and he's known as Iqbal Lahori in Persia. He wrote more in Farsi than he wrote in Urdu, but he wrote in Urdu extensively as well. And he says that we Persians, he's saying as a Persian, we Persians came very late to Iqbal. And he said we should have came sooner. And he said, I tell everyone to read Iqbal and learn from Iqbal. On top of that, he knows maybe 1,000 couplets of his by heart, number one. So I'm trying to see how it is that we can understand this, to live the Quran practically, to live Islam practically, to live the essence of why it is that someone would want to come here, right? Number one. Number two is another example. Imran Khan, you must have heard, the cricketer and politician, right? And philanthropist. Whatever your political views about the guy, put that aside for a second and just listen to what I'm about to say. So he's giving a talk at Oxford University, right? And at the Oxford Union. And so the talk is on leadership. And he's been asked to speak about leadership. And they say that, you've been a leader in cricket, you've been a leader in the areas of philanthropy, you've been a leader in politics. So what are your thoughts and reflections on this? And so he says the number one element for a leader is to have a vision about where you're going. Because that vision motivates and inspires others around you, and it leads other people to go towards that. And so he says a line in there, and he says, in my opinion, in his view, he says the greatest Muslim philosopher, or the greatest philosopher the Muslim world produced, his view, in the last 500 years, he says Iqbal Lahori, the same guy who Ayatollah Khamenei was mentioning. And so this led me to a journey. I had heard about Iqbal, but I wanted to investigate his life. You have to know 3 phases of him. And by the way, if you think that this is against the Quran, I'll try to elaborate where does Islam come into this, and it's the nucleus of it is Islam. The third element is Iqbal. So who is this guy and why is it important? This guy is somebody who was living 100 years ago, at the turn of the century, late 1800s, early 1900s, and he's looking at the world around him. And he's somebody who's living in the subcontinent, and he's moved to Europe, and he goes to LMU, which as you know is the top institution in Germany, and he studies there, he goes to England, and then eventually he returns. And he sees a philosophical movement that is arising in Europe, and that is a philosophy called existentialism. This is a philosophy that says that we need to focus on the here and now and existence and people. And he understood that this tsunami is coming that may overtake the world, and the Muslim world may be left behind. And so he investigated the Islamic tradition. He said, hold on a second, Islam wasn't always like this. Islam was leading the world in many areas from 800 to 1100 AD. That's where algebra is coming from. That's where much of the world's success in philanthropy and areas of medicine and mental health and many things are coming. And so he came up with this concept which he calls khudi. Now, khudi is a form of reliance, self-reliance through reliance in Allah. And that means that I realize that the one who has my back is Allah. The one who has this concept of allowing me to succeed is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they asked him, where did your philosophy come from? Where did this concept come from? And I'm telling you this because this may be the form of Islam that we'll need to implement in this part of the world in order for it to thrive. And he said it's straight from the Quran. He said, where in the Quran? He said, Surah Hashr. Surah Hashr, where in Surah Hashr? He said, verse 19. So what does verse 19 say of Surah Hashr? This book that's a book of life. وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ نَسُوا اللَّهَ فَأَنْسَاهُمْ أَنفُسَهُم. So he says, the Quran says, do not be like those who forgot Allah, who forgot God, and God made them forget themselves. And what the ulama say is this means that they became so mindless of God that God eventually made them forget that which was in their own benefit. So you went into the quicksand of life, so to speak. So he said, all I did was, I just inverted this verse. That if the verse says, don't be like those who forgot God, God made them forget themselves. So what happens if you always remember God? Then God will make you know and remember that which is in your own benefit. And he said that's the essence of the concept of khudi. So now, if we want these centers to be vibrant, 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, we have to make them pillars of excellence. Where people say that it's not a zero-sum game that between life and the masjid, that for example, if I have no other work, I have no other things, I have no other obligations, then I'll try to make it to the mosque. But rather, we say, and people say, look, I don't flourish in other parts of my life if I don't have this participation in the community, this participation in the mosque. That is, my work, my school, my life, my family life, my success, everything is coming from this vehicle, which is ultimately coming from God, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so what ends up happening is, when we look at Islam that way, it becomes active. People ask, for example, how do you live Islam? How do you understand the Quran? Take chapters of the Quran, take verses of the Quran, take segments of verses from the Quran, and look at how you can use them to motivate yourself to live higher. You know, we often don't talk about these. You know, when I was growing up, the model of what I saw as somebody who was a religious person, what I was told from the member, and my perception was that essentially, you want the akhirah and you want the other world, well, you have to be a loser here. That was the perception that was taught, that you, wealth-wise, economically, everything. I never understood this growing up. People would come up, the Maulana would come up, with due respect, and all respect to them, they would come up and they would say, this world has no value, this world is nothing, this world is, you know, it's going to be, everything's the akhirah. Fantastic. And as soon as they would get down, somebody would come up and say, look guys, we got to raise 100,000 for the mosque. Can you help us out? It was completely an opposite conversion. They were going in different directions. And when I looked at it, there's a dua, and this is where I'll probably bring this to a close. What's your dua? You know, Laylatul Qadr just passed, you know, and inshallah the next one you'll be here next year. Between now and then, what's your dua? What's your prayer? Ya Allah, give me some wealth, give me some income, give me some health, give me some popularity, fame, whatever it is. Fantastic. Compare your dua now to the dua of Sulaiman in the Quran. And Sulaiman says in the Quran, Rabbi, Habli, Solomon. Sulaiman, you know, I was at the Met, and they had this amazing rendition over 200 years old or 150 years old of the temple built by Solomon. It was even in the replica, it was magnificent. Anyways, Sulaiman says in the Quran, you know, Dawood, Sulaiman, these were kings. And so his prayer in the Quran is, Rabbi habli mulkan la yanbaghi ahadan min ba'di. Oh Allah, God, give me a kingdom which nobody will have after me. So he's not saying, make me the richest guy in town. He's saying, God, give me such a kingdom that even after, till the day of judgment, no one's going to have it like that. And you know what adds that to the, you know what adds it? You know what puts that to another level? For me, at least in my mind, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran again says, إِنَّمَا وَلِيُّكُمُ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَالَّذِينَ يُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةَ وَيُؤْتُونَ الزَّكَاةَ وَهُمْ رَاكِعُونَ. That verily your wali is Allah and the messenger and the one who in a state of ruku gives zakat. And ask every historian, when it came to this verse, it was revealed in honor of Imam Ali alayhi salam. When a person came into the masjid asking for something, and he's saying, can you give me something, can you help me out? Nobody is responding. He's about to leave empty-handed, and then eventually he addresses God. First he's addressing the people, then he's addressing God, and he says to Allah, Ya Allah, bear witness, I am leaving your house without anything. And at that point, the historians and the Mufassirin say that Imam Ali gestured with his finger. And the person who was there saw and he noticed that this is something that he's being indicated to do. And he comes and he takes off the ring of Imam Ali alayhi salam. When this happens, the Prophet comes into the masjid afterwards and he says, did anyone give zakat? Did anyone give charity? Did anyone do some charity? And at that point in time, there were others who were saying, yes, Ya Rasulullah, Ali gave in the state of salah, he's giving charity. As in he should have been in, they were thinking he should have been in a state where he's focusing only on his salah. And the ulama also answer this. And they say that the state of the affairs was such that when it came to this, when the person asking was asking the people, no, Imam Ali was not focused there. But the concept in namaz, in salah, in iman, is as-salat mi'rajul mu'min. That prayer is the height and the elevation of a believer, the mi'raj of the believer. So when he addressed Allah, Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen is spiritually in the domain of Allah. So that connection happened at that moment. So Imam Ali gives it, the ayah comes, إِنَّمَا وَلِيُّكُمُ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَالَّذِينَ يُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةَ وَيُؤْتُونَ الزَّكَاةَ. But the question remains, what was the khairat that he gave? What was the zakat that he gave? What was the charity that Imam Ali gave in that state? And every historian wrote that that ring that Imam Ali alayhi salam gave, it was the one that was inscribed with the stamp of Sulaiman. Meaning, the way that Solomon used to run his entire kingdom was with that ring. And this is the dominion of Sulaiman. So wherever Sulaiman's kingdom ends, the charity of Ali ibn Abi Talib begins. Salam. The complete way of life. So Islam and your life are not at odds. Everyone's been asking me, what should our agenda be in politics, economics? Very simple. Your agenda in politics, in economics, and in every aspect of life should be the same. The agenda of Rasulullah and Imam Ali alayhi salam, that's it. Because that was the agenda of humanity. And you won't have to worry about the Muslim vote. If you implement that, you'll get more non-Muslim votes. Because it was the concept of the Ahlul Bayt. That's how they operated. They wanted to make sure you take care of the most marginalized member of society, and everything else will take care of itself. So the principle of being a mu'min and a believer is simply this. Being a good Muslim is being a good human being 2.0. The prerequisite to being a good Muslim is to be a good human being. Everything above that is added bonus as followers of Ahlul Bayt. This is what it means to pursue Kamal. Bring justice, bring fairness, bring equity to your society, to our society, to the world, through the message of Islam, Quran, Rasulullah, and Imam Ali alayhi salam. And you will notice that these centers will flourish well beyond the next 100, 200 years, well after we're gone, inshallah. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, wa ala ahli bayt at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Okay, inshallah. It's a bit longer than short intro, but any questions, comments, concerns, or thoughts? I should probably let that marinate for a second. It's right after iftar. Any thoughts? Make sense? No? Doesn't make sense? What do you guys think we should do? Let me give you some more thoughts. Yeah, definitely. So the concept was, so I'll add a really good point here. So I went to India a couple of years ago for some philanthropic work, and so I visited all these different cities. I went to Bombay, Bhavnagar, I went to Lucknow, Hyderabad, Bangalore, and I'm visiting all these different places, and I'm trying to figure out, what happened here? Because I don't know if you know this, historically, the houses in Najaf and Qom, economically 200 to 300 years ago, they used to run with Indian money. As in, there was no local money in the Arab belt. All the funds used to come from Lucknow and Hyderabad, predominantly, because there were two dynasties that were there that were funding these. But what happened now? As in fact, Ayatollah Sistani was asked about this, and he was one of the leaders of the community in the subcontinent, and said, do you have any advice? He said, you guys need to go back to your origin. He said, you guys were leading the Hausa for a long time, and you were funding it, and now it's like the opposite. And so I asked people what happened. Like, this place used to produce big scholars. And one of the responses that I kept getting back was, in the 20th century something happened. And that was that if you could become a doctor, you became a doctor. If you could become an engineer, you became an engineer. And if you could become an entrepreneur, you became an entrepreneur. But if you couldn't do anything else, you ended up becoming a Maulana. That's what they told me. That's what they told me. And so, this is a problem, because if you remember what Imran Khan said as well, the leadership's first job is vision. And if your vision as a leader is limited, then that means by default everyone else's vision is going to be limited. Because as a leader, you're supposed to chart the vision for other people. And so this is a huge problem that we face. And so the reality of the matter, this is number one. Number two is the political dynamics that emerged. And you can read books that Orientalists have written on Saudi Arabia and the Middle East about how a concept of Islam that is not Islam was reverse engineered and implemented to make the populace passive. Islam was a very practical, active religion, but because this activism was a problem to rulers, it was a big problem. You can read a book called Khilafat wa Mulukiyat by Abu Ala Maududi, who's not a Shia, he's a Sunni. But he said, look, Islam didn't have a concept of kingdoms, but how did it go from caliphates to kingdoms? And it's a very interesting question. And if you look at the history of the West, It went from kingdoms to democracy relatively. Islam seemed to go the opposite way, and no one's batting an eye or a finger. These are important questions to look at. So now coming to the concept of khudi. He said that the narrative amongst the general populace is becoming that I have nothing. I'm nothing, like everything's destined and predestined to be. So there are things that we need to revive. So for example, Imam Ali was asked, what type of sustenance is there, risk? Is it that whatever is there is going to be there and I don't have to work for it? He says, no. There's two types of risk. One which will search you out wherever you are, and there's one that you have to go after it. You have to go find it. You have to struggle for it. And so he said, how is it that one will find you no matter what you do? He said, well, it will find you the way death will find you. And he said, what about the other one? He said, the other one, you have to struggle for it. You have to strive for it. So you may go to Allah and say that, oh, Allah, you gave that guy $1 billion, but you didn't give me. And Allah may say that, you know, I had written a lot for you, but you didn't take the action. You didn't make the struggle to make that happen. The same may happen with life, right? Allah may say, someone may get to Allah and he say, Ya Allah, you only gave me 65, 70, 85 years. That person lived to a 90, 101 healthy. And Allah will say, well, yeah, but I wrote a long life for you, but you were smoking. You were eating way more sugar than you should be eating. You are not taking care of yourself. I was reading something in the Washington Post. There's a guy, you know, in medicine they're saying today there's your date of birth, your physical age, and your mental age. These are all three different things. So this guy is 94 years old, and he's a professional rower. He used to be a professional rower, but biologically he's about 39 years old. And so what I'm telling you is, Allah has given you this gift. And Allah says in the Quran, وَلَئِن شَكَرْتُمْ لَأَزِيدَنَّكُمْ, that if you are grateful, I will increase it. وَلَئِن كَفَرْتُمْ إِنَّ عَذَابِي لَشَدِيدٌ, and if you are not, then definitely the opposite is true as well. So one form of being grateful for something is that you take care of it. Allah's given us this body, we should take care of it. Allah's given us aql, we should take care of it. So now coming to the concept of khudi, he said that, and by the way, if you know the history, you'll know that iqbal to shari'ati to Khomeini, you can draw a straight line. There's no Iranian revolution without iqbal in terms of philosophical, ideological. They used to chalk the poetry of Iqbal on the streets prior to the revolution. So the grassroots movement was the views of Iqbal. And he was saying, look, Islam is very active. This led to Shari'ati saying there's two types of Shi'ism, black Shi'ism and red Shi'ism. And the idea was black Shi'ism is this passive view and red is active. So for example, black Shi'ism would say, you know, we're Mazloom, we can't do anything, woe is us. Whereas red Shi'ism says, no, Imam Hussein is the one who's going to the battlefield. Imam Hussein's doing something. He didn't just sit and succumb. He sparked a revolution that woke up generation after generation after generation after him. Imam Ali is in the battlefield of life. Rasulullah is in the battlefield of life. So this was the concept of this notion of khudi that inspires people to not just live a small game and live a small life. To do something much bigger. To do something much more profound. To say that the world can be a better place. So I'll give you an example. So this, again, I don't get any loyalties out of this. I'm just sharing this as an example that you may say, how can I make my life, my career, how can I live one life? You know, many people in our world are living in our communities. By the way, other communities have their own problems, right? But I'm talking to you because we're in the ship together. I don't have access to them. That's their problem. We're dealing with our problems. And so the idea was, many people are living two lives. There's this idea of compartmentalization. This is what's happened with religion in the West. There's religion on Sundays for the Christian, there's religion on Saturdays for the Jew, and there's religion on Friday for the Muslims. And everything else, who knows? That's not what it was supposed to be like. It was supposed to be you have one life, and that life is supposed to help you. And I need to share this with you because people don't understand this concept, because it's something called ghalatul amma. You know ghalatul amma? Ghalatul amma is something that's so spread that it's wrong, but it's so common that if you tell people the truth, they'll be like, you lost your marbles. You don't know what you're talking about. So, you know TED, have you ever heard of TED Talks? Does anyone know what TED stands for? Excellent. Technology, Education, Design. This is what everyone thinks. And thank you for participating. But what if I told you it actually stands for Technology, Entertainment, Design? And I didn't know this either. But most people, everyone thinks it's actually Technology, Education, Design. And even if you ask the founders, they'll say, we don't want people to remember what it actually stands for. But the concept is, there are principles within Islam. The same way I told you, ibadah is not just namaz, although that's very important. There's much deeper layers to it. Similarly, when it comes to this concept of this notion of what we're supposed to be practicing in our faith, we need to reinvestigate it. There are things that we know, things that we don't know that we don't know. There's things that we need to be cognizant of, mindful, to try to shift the paradigm. So when it comes to khudi, so this example of this business, The guy's name is Safwan Shah. He started a company called Pay Active. Why? So he's an entrepreneur out in Silicon Valley. He started his first company, went really well, and then he's on the golf course. And he's saying, I always tell people you can learn about Islam through golf. The sabr, the tahammul that you need, the patience, it's incredible. Because you can't blame anybody. Your opponent's in the mirror. And so if anyone's to blame, it's you. This is what Islam is telling you also about your nafs. So now, he said, hold on a second. The Bible says that pay the wage of the laborer before the sun sets, for they are poor and in need of it. This is what the Bible said. And he says, the Prophet has said, and I know this and you all know this, the Prophet said, pay the wage of the laborer before their sweat dries. Right? And he said, then, well, why is it that in America, if you have a business and you have employees, you can shut your ears for a second. But he said, why is it in America we pay employees on a 2-week cycle? Why? And on top of that, if you look at it from economic terms, you'd find that it's like the employer taking a 2-week free loan from the employee. And then he looked deeper and he said, in America, we milk the poorest Americans for $30 to $40 billion with a B in auto loan liens, high interest liens, payday loans, hugely exorbitant forms of interest. We're milking the poorest Americans with them. He said, this can't be right. And so he built a company called PayActive, which you can check the app. Walmart, many other companies are on board today. And they give people something called earned wage access. So the day you work, that day you can get your income. So you don't have to take out these very valuable. That's also ibadah in a form. So you may think that there's 3 categories, as Imam Ali says. There's of people in society. There's the teachers, there's the students, and there's hamaj al-ra'a. So there's teachers who are teaching and guiding people. There are students who are, on the path of knowledge. And then there are people who are like the leaves in autumn. They just flow with wherever the drift goes. Our societies have drifts with them. Now the question is, are we just going with the flow of society, the drift of society? Or are we saying, hold on a second, I need to check myself to make the drift of society better? You know what is another low-hanging fruit that you can work on? Maybe not the lowest hanging, but it's a worthwhile problem. Musk talks about this, right? Elon Musk, whatever is your personal views on the guy. But he says that, some problems, even if you fail, they're still worth investigating. They're still worth trying on. And similarly, another one that's a major zulm in our society is this concept of amortization. You know amortization? Where they front load the interest on you. And many Americans have no idea of the fiscal and financial aspects of society, and they're being milked. If you're in real estate and property, sorry, I'm just saying it like it is. And so it's important for us to be mindful of these aspects of the equation. So Islam inherently, there's another. I'm not saying Islam's against capitalism. In fact, there's a book by Benedict Kohler. It's called Early Islam and the Birth of Capitalism. In the book, Kohler argues that the first capitalist in history was the Prophet Muhammad, his view. And he says the reason is, since the time, there was a drought in Medina. And when there was a drought in Medina, up until that point in history, there was always a principle that if there is a phenomenon such as a drought, people intervene in the markets to regulate prices. And the Prophet didn't intervene. He said Islam says focus on people's akhlaq and their ethics to a point that they know in their heart what's right and wrong. And they implement it. So you don't have to force them. So this was something that was a totally different dynamic. As Muslims, we should be contributing to our broader society to make the world a better place, to the point that people say, look, these followers of Ahlul Bayt, our world is becoming better for them. That same book that I mentioned to you earlier, Religion and Immigration, it talks about how did the Jewish community in America change the narrative about how they were discriminated against. And so they said in Brooklyn, 100 years ago, if you could afford a doctor to come to your house, you would be able to pay them to come to your house, and they would look after your kids and your family, and they would treat you. But if you couldn't afford it, which was the vast majority of people, what did you do? You did some herbal remedies and you prayed. And so what happened is in Brooklyn and other boroughs, the Jewish community set up clinics, which we would now call clinics today, but at the time they were hospitals. And they put 2 beds and 1 doctor, and they would treat people free of cost. And so those same people who were discriminating and saying, things that were discriminatory against the Jewish community eventually started saying, hold on a second, we're discriminating against these people, but when we're sick, we send our kids here, and they're the reasons that they're still alive. So it started changing the narrative. Similarly, as a believer in Islam, if you look at the Ahlul Bayt, they always emphasize the marginalized, whether they're Muslim or not. They focus on the rights of Christians. They focus on the rights of non-Muslims. They focus on those rights. And of course, when there was a majority Muslim community, their rights were also looked at. But the principle was, as a believer, as a mu'min, as a Muslim, by our existence, society should flourish for the better.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. So, any questions from ladies? I'm a little surprised, like, you guys are really silent. Any question?
Yes.
And I only have the privilege of getting bits and pieces of your lectures because of these ones that have crossed your path, within the past 10 minutes. I am unaware whether she's an economist or a philanthropist or a historian. So if you can touch a little bit on her, since, I'm actually listening to you right now. And the request part is that you made references to a bunch of her books, two that I can think of. If you can compile a list of them and post them somewhere, that would be awesome.
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. So I think on both counts, that's very good.
Thank you.
I often reference a lot of books. The way my mind works is I sometimes forget the ones I've referenced during the course of the lecture. So sometimes, but there are people, believe it or not, maybe they have nothing better to do. They listen to my lectures 3 times because I go very fast, and they do get something eventually after the 3rd time. I know it's very dense in terms of its content, but I'll try to share those. Karen Armstrong, I met her a couple of years ago, and she was at the UPNA conference, the Pakistani Physicians Conference. It happens in Orlando and another place every year. They alternate. And so she's a historian by training. She was at Oxford University, and she was studying to be a nun, and she decided not to eventually. And she's written a series of books in history on every major faith, but predominantly Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I often reference her because she has an outsider perspective. And so sometimes you need an outsider perspective to calibrate your internal compass as well. And so I don't use her as a primary source, but a different perspective. She also mentioned something which others have said, but sometimes we're more tolerant when outsiders say it sometimes. And so she said that she said everywhere she gets called by the Muslim community to speak, they always ask her, well, how will Islam go back to the golden age and the golden time? And she says that it will not happen until you send your best minds to mullah school. And the reality of the matter is, this is something that, there's an old saying that you reap what you sow. And this is something that we are facing very difficultly. I have people and friends and people who are asking, should I go to Hawza or not? And we have real honest conversations about it. Or some people who have gone and they come back, and there's this huge intellectual gap between the community and the populace and the scholar who's come back. And so what ends up happening is the scholars are like, well, people should be coming to this side of town. And people are like, well, we don't have time for that. And so it ends up being a non-starter. So I said this a few years ago, maybe it's been 5 years since I've been saying this, that the resident alim model is dead in America. Because it's a lose-lose proposition. The Maulanas are fed up with it, and the people are fed up with it. The same way the people have a grades for every Maulana, Maulanas have a grade for every community. And believe me, they're harsh. So, and if you ask them, those are those dynamics. I'll give you an example. I was lecturing in a community. So I'm not a Maulana, so I speak freely to people. And so they feel comfortable with me. And I feel like these things need to be in the public square. So there's a Maulana who's drowning. You ever heard this? There's a Maulana who's drowning. Well, the Maulana should know how to swim, by the way. Islamic, it's recommended. Anyways, so he's drowning. And when he's drowning, eventually, the whole community comes and says, Maulana, give me your hand, give me your hand. And the Maulana's not giving his hand. He's just continuing to drown. And they're like, we can just give us your hand and we'll save you. And eventually he doesn't give the hand. And then eventually the president of the community comes around. He says, I got this, don't worry. And so he comes out, he pulls out his wallet, and he looks through his cash. He pulls out a 100, folds it up, and he extends it to the Maulana. He says, Maulana, take this. And the Maulana extends his hand. He grabs it and he comes back. And then he saves his life, and he looks at the community and he says, Maulvi kabhi dete nahi hai, lete hain. And that's the presumption. We have a lot of double standards in our community. And the double standards in our community are like this notion that, people will come up to the Maulana, they'll say, beta or son, meet the Maulana, kiss the Maulana's hand, hug them, and all that. And as soon as they turn around, they're like, you need to respect him, but never be like him. Because that's a failure of a life. And so when people see that, they realize that there's not integrity in that position, and then it's a pseudo-respect. Pseudo-like concepts. So even, I often say this in the Jewish community, I have Jewish friends, I'm sure you do as well, And so there's a concept amongst rabbis, not all communities, but some communities, that if the rabbi makes a decision, it's binding. Like people agree that he's the final point of decision. In our communities, if you don't like the Maulana's decision, you find another Maulana. And so you've got to be very clear and practical about what one of the ulama said this, or scholars or speakers said this very well. Hum Maula ko mante, Maula ki nahi mante. And the reality is that's exactly what it is. We listen, Maula, we believe in the Imam, we believe Ahlul Bayt, but we don't listen to what they said to do. We don't implement what they asked us to do. We don't do that. And so if that's the case, then I mean the result is in front of you. Alhamdulillah, it's not the case at Icon, but I often say this wherever I'm traveling. Outside it says Imam Ali Center, Rasulullah Center, Imam Hussein Center. On the outside it says Imam Ali Center, and inside it's Muawiyah politics. And so people are like, so I'm like, well, why would someone want to come? And that's where we have to change this paradigm. I'm not saying this above you, I'm saying this in the ship with you, in the boat with you, that we have to change this if we want people to come. We seem to have a very slight varnish of Islam in our centers. That is basically, you know, I'm sprinkling some masala on it to add Islam, but the essence may not be Islam. And unless we don't change that, we may not be able to have a better, brighter future. But we have an option, an opportunity now, inshallah. Yes, sister, I think that is. Wa alaikum salam. Yeah, sure. So thank you for having me.
I just raised my hand because I just wanted you to kind of elaborate along with what you're kind of talking about right now and what you've said previously. You said that many of your friends no longer come to the centers. They feel like they're not really getting anything out of it. And then right now you're talking about Imam Ali versus like Muawiyah politics on the inside. So from your own life experience and from your experience from traveling around the world, seeing different centers, different communities, I'm sure some communities you find are more successful than other communities. I'm sure you may see in some communities the youth are more involved or the youth attend the centers more. So can you give us specific, practical things that we can do to elevate our communities?
Absolutely.
And, you know, make sure that the kids come, the youth come, the young come. You know, we don't need to lose more generations. So I want specifics.
Yeah, excellent.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay. How much time you got? Okay, great. Okay, great question. So a couple of things that come to mind on solution fronts and what we could do. So with respect to this and building the community, you have to ask, what do people want? So when Islam came, Rasulullah invited people with da'wat zul ashira, right? He invited them to eat, and they came to eat for 3 days, and he gave the message. Today, food doesn't have that appeal. I can go down and I can get 1,000 different places to eat in New York and Long Island, right? And so the menu at the Imam Bara it's a tough sell. So what I mean is the biryani has evolved. And what that means is the catch and the lure is different. So you have to figure out, what do people want in life? So you ask people, they say, okay, I want to make sure my kids have a good education. They get a good education. I want them to get in like Ivy League schools, top schools. Fantastic. I want them to get a good career established, entrepreneurially or career-wise. I want them to be set. Okay, fantastic. Number 3, I want them to get married. I want them to have a good marriage, and not only just get married, but having a good, happy, sustained marriage, which is very fulfilling on both sides. So these are very valuable things. There's nothing here against Islam. So use that as a mechanism to improve the quality of life of people through the masjid, through the Imam Barga, through the Hussainiyah. So I'll give you an example. We're having a brain drain of our best minds across America, because you're asking like the perspective about what's going on across America. So I coach some very few people, like on a hand, I can count on a hand how many people I coach. And this was something that people who are my friends and mentors and people who have done well in our communities, they asked me to coach and mentor their kids. Because they're like, there's Islam and the Islamic system, and then there is this notion of our secular life, but Islam didn't have this differentiation, but there's a school of life that's missing, right, in between. It was supposed to be here and it was supposed to be there, but it's neither place. So how can you help people live through the principles of Islam? So I mentor a few of these guys, but I understand that can't be scaled. That's cost prohibitive for most people. So Islam is not about the elites. It's not about the wealthies and the haves should only be practicing. So what's happening is there are people in our community who are very affluent, very educated, very everything, but they're not coming to the mosque. Not because they're not practicing, but because what I've experienced in many of them is they're not getting added value from the mosque. They're saying, well, I can watch online, and even then, that's not adding it. I'm getting more from books and personal discussions. So what's the added value of the mosque? So this is something that we need to look at, number 1. Number 2 is, well, some of these same families are able to afford private tutors for their kids to get them into Ivy League schools, for example, right? Maybe that's cost-prohibitive for some families. But if you pool resources and benefit from economies of scale, why can't you have that in the center, right? 3, 4 people, 5 people pitching together the cost, and you accelerate people to get into the top institutions and the top schools. Entrepreneurship. You know, I never heard much about this growing up, about what does Islam say about career development, you know? If Islam is a complete way of life, it should tell me something about my job, my income, my economics. And when I found it and I read it in the books, there was a huge ocean. And do you know what the most recommended career in Islam is? Business, entrepreneurship, tijara. And we have numerous traditions about this. But somehow, when you ask your parents, and I grew up in this generation, my parents may be different, everyone thinks they're different, but, you know, like, if you tell parents that, you know, become a doctor, you become an engineer, all that, fantastic, and then you say, now I want to start a business, they'll be like, bhuke mar jaoge. And so, that's a challenge. And so, that means that we don't have full tawakkul and trust in Allah, that means, right? We still have some work to do. And I'll give you a secret, by the way. You know, a simple solution, according to stats in America, most entrepreneurs don't succeed on their first or second venture. They succeed on their third and fourth venture. But you learn such valuable lessons in the first and second that you apply to the third and fourth. And so there's no such thing as failure, there's only learning. So what I mean by that is, if you're really worried about it, then get your kids to learn early. Get them started while they're under mom and dad's roof. So eventually, by the time they're 16, 17, 18, they've already had 1 or 2 ventures under the belt, and then they're ready to apply it. So these are things that you can have. You should have more entrepreneurial workshops, how to think about problems, how to solve problems, how to think about conscious capitalism. You know, we have unconscious capitalism in our societies. Conscious capitalism is what I was mentioning earlier about this concept of, you know, the Safwan Shah and the Pay Active. Again, full disclosure, I'm on this board, so take it with a grain of salt, but I'm on the board of a Sharia-compliant hedge fund, right? A Sharia portfolio, right? So a couple of months ago, I was at the New York Stock Exchange ringing the bell on the stock exchange. And I went there deliberately because I wanted to be known that Islam and this doesn't have to be at odds. As in, you can have an ethical principle of this, or at least try to be in that domain. Or for example, what about the views of Shaykh Baqir Sadr? These discussions should happen, right? In seminars, workshops, where he studied economics, he studied capitalism, he studied communism, he studied Islam, and he said, hold on a second. Anybody who goes to an MBA course or a first-year business course knows that there's the time value of money, right? And they know that, for example, if you give me $100 today, it's not $100 tomorrow, right? It's not the same $100 if I give you $100 in a year, right? So there's an opportunity cost. There's an inflationary cost, right? So if you give me $100 today, a year later, maybe with inflation right now, it's like $80 maybe or something like that. It's brutal. And so Shaheed al-Sadr had this view. Everyone else disagreed with him, but he had the view. And the view was that in Islam, what is haram is the same thing that was haram in Christianity, which is riba, which is usury, not interest. His view. And he said that based on this, to make people whole again, you should have a flat rate of interest that should be acceptable. So this is not shared with people. So some of the views that are in the Hawza don't trickle down. And this is where we can have dialogues and discussions and forums to say, how can we do ethical conscious capitalism? You know, there's many businesses today in society that have a transparency model. Have you ever heard of this? They say, we're going to make the business model and the supply chain transparent. So before, people have been using exorbitant aspects of it, but we're going to make it more transparent, and we're going to take a profit along the way. But it's going to be a reasonable profit. You want to know something? I'll tell you something. Ayatollah Shahabadi. You may say that I can't live Islam through this. Ayatollah Shahabadi was the spiritual teacher of many scholars, and he was a big-time arif and a mystic, and he was one of the biggest teachers, spiritual teachers of Ayatollah Khomeini. And so this is a documented event. He used to lead namaz and salah in Tehran. And when he used to lead by the bazaar in Tehran, Ayatollah Shahabadi, 100 years ago. And he used to lead this jamaat and this namaz there. And eventually one day he told the people there who were in the salah, he said, when are you going to lift yourself spiritually? When are you going to raise yourself spiritually? When are you going to elevate yourself spiritually? And so they listened, and eventually one of the guys said, you know, Agha, Sheikh, what can we do? We're merchants, we're businessmen, we work in the bazaar. How can we be spiritually elevated? And he said, you want to know how you can? I'll tell you exactly what you can do. And so now, did he say, like, open up Mafatihul Jinan, recite it beginning to end, open up the Quran, read it 12 times a day? Did he say that? No. He said, just do the following, and you'll notice differences in your life if you apply what I say. He said, number one, no matter what happens, pray on time as much as possible. rain, snow, pray on time as much as possible, and in jama'at, in congregation, as much as possible. So for them, they were just across the street, so it wasn't that difficult, number one. Number two, he said, anybody who comes to your shop, foreigner, local, doesn't matter, treat them fairly. So don't price gouge on foreigners and don't take advantage of them. Take a profit that's reasonable, but if they're from out of town, don't take advantage of them. I said, okay, fair enough. He said, number three, I know, he's saying, I know that khums is wajib once a year, but I'm telling you to take it out once a month. You'll end up in the same neighborhood anyways, right? The frequency is different. Anyways, he said, just take it out once a month, I'm telling you, because it's a form of purifying your wealth. It's a form of purification. Anyways, he said, do it and see what happens. So there was one guy who was who heard what he said. You know, hearing is one, implementation is another thing. Anyways, so he's there, and when he's there, he said, I heard what Ayatollah Shahabadi said, and I went, and I said, let me try to implement it. So he said, I implemented it for 3 months, and eventually I was in a namaz-e-jama'at in another city, in another part of town. And I was reading salat there, and the person who was leading salat, or the prayer, eventually what happened was, I noticed him say Takbiratul Ihram. He said, Allahu Akbar, enters the salah, and a few moments later, he's gone. And I noticed he's in ruku. And then a few moments later, he's gone. And then I noticed him in sujood. And I'm like, what's going on here? And then he's gone. He's standing up. I said, what's going on here? And so after the salah, the merchant, the businessman says, he went to Ayatollah Shahabadi, the imam of this jamaat, and he said, look, I was in salah and prayer and I noticed that you were there one moment, you're gone the next. You're there and you're gone, you're there and you're gone. What's going on? And he said, you noticed that? What? How? I said, that's what I noticed, that's what I saw. I'm just telling you like it is. He says, those exact moments are the moments where my tawajjuh, my focus was going in and out. He said, you saw that? I said, yeah, I saw that. So he went back to, the merchant went back to Ayatollah Shahabadi. He told him what happened. He said, what else did you think was going to happen? So what I'm saying is, there's a moment and an opportunity for you where you're sitting, where you're standing to reach elevated spiritual positions. It doesn't have to be that I always book a ticket to Najaf and Karbala. That's great. But you don't always have to do that. The same Allah that's there is the same Allah that's here. And so the principle is, just a few tweaks here and there can change the dynamic. So what we can do in the mosque and the center is exactly that. That people say, I can't miss mosque, I can't miss the Husayniyah, I can't miss the Imam Barga, because it invigorates me, it motivates me, it inspires me to go back into the battlefield of life and do amazing things. We should encourage people's vision. We should encourage and motivate them to say, okay, if they have an idea of solving problems. You know how many problems there are, for example, of injustices in society? You know, the mental health crisis that's going on. You know how difficult it is for some people to navigate the mental health phenomenon that's going on in our country? Like just getting their medicines, for example, just getting treatment, for example. You know, the whole history of mental health is being upturned. At Stanford University, they have a Muslim mental health lab that's investigating this, and we thought that the first mental health hospitals came about in the world, in Europe, 400 years ago. But now we're finding out they were in the Muslim world 1,000 years ago. So these are things where we should be trailblazing society and not on the wake and the back end and saying that, you know, they're doing this good and we should also do it good. No, we should be accelerating this process to try to make the world a better place through means of that. So this is where we can implement things. Get kids into Ivy League schools and top tier institutions, get them into great careers, problem solving in jobs in other areas, and marriage and family life, which is a huge one. And we need to look at those things to not only get people married in a happy, in a loving, compassionate way, but also help them flourish. You know, there's solutions to these things today. Help people find their callings. I believe Allah's given everyone a gift. And sometimes we just have to help people find that gift. There's a guy named, there's a book, a couple of books I'll recommend to you. You can add this to the list if someone's adding these. The book is called The Circle Blueprint. One of the authors is Jack Skeen. And the way I got to this book was an investor by the name of Monish Pabrai. So he wrote a book called, Monish Pabrai is an investor who won a bid to have lunch with Warren Buffett, you know, the annual Berkshire Hathaway lunch, so he won it one year. And so he wrote a book called The Dhando Investor. So if anyone knows Gujarati, you know what Dhando means, right? So he said, in the subtitle of the book is Heads I Win, Tails I Don't Lose Much. And anyways, in that book, he mentions a few things in his interviews as well, Monish Pabrai. He says that I I was like a typical Indian, he says, and I was at Clemson University studying engineering, and my roommate, he says, I'm not Gujarati, but my roommate was Gujarati, and every single weekend he would come home from working at his family's motel, and he would come back and say, do dhando, do dhando, do dhando. And he said, I was like, what is this? And so it woke him up. Eventually, he said, I got a job, and I worked in engineering, and eventually, I saw a business opportunity, and I remembered what my friend said, and I executed on the business opportunity, and eventually, I did very well in the business. But he said, I hated my life. He said, I became a CEO of a company, and I became an adult babysitter. He said, I never wanted to be an adult babysitter. I didn't want to be people coming, HR issues, they're coming into my office, and I'm solving their problem. I hated it. So he said, I hired this guy named Jack Skeen, who was a psychologist and an executive coach, and he followed me for 3 months, and he did a deep psychology profile on me, or psychological profile, and he came back with some results. Now, at that time, it was like 10 grand a pop, and it was cost prohibitive for most people. It's more now. But anyways, he said after 3 months that, Monish, I figured you out that you're a very competitive person, but you're an individually competitive person. Meaning you're a tennis player or a golf player. You're not a team player. You're not a basketball player or a soccer player. You're a by yourself kind of guy. He said, think about this, and he told him a few other things. He said, think about that and come back to me and tell me what you think you want to do. And so he said he came back after a week and he said, I figured it out. I want to be in investment. I love that. I can do it by myself. It's my interest. It's my passion. It's competitive. There's a scorecard, all of this. And so Jack Sheen writes him a check. He said, I'm your first investor. He said, what, you don't know anything about my abilities in investing. He said, I know everything I need to know. And that day and this day, the guy's done phenomenal in turning money. But what I mean is, there was a journey for him to find his strength, for example. So in the community, by the way, I called up this guy, Jack Skeen, cold, and he picked up. And he was willing, I mean, if you talk to people, amazing things happen. So maybe people in our community, some people can afford it, but not everyone can afford it. But if you use economies of scale, you can invite someone like him, have their books there, and then you spread the cost, and then you can solve these problems and accelerate it. We have data today that certain people with certain types, for example, psychologically, I can't tell you how many people in our communities, because I meet people like some of the most affluent members of our community, how many of them have in some form either OCD, bipolarity, ADHD, or something like that, but they are successful not in spite of it, but because of it. There's a book I recommend you read. It's called A First-Rate Madness by Dr. Nassim Ghami. He's the head of psychiatry at Tufts University. And he said he went through the profile of US presidents, and he said that he found Kennedy, Roosevelt, he went through all of them. And he said, I found that the most successful presidents in US history, they were successful, and many of them had mental health challenges, and they were successful not in spite of, but because of their mental health challenges. Allah says in the Quran, Inna ma'al usri yusra. With hardship comes ease. So everything's a double-edged sword. I have friends on Wall Street right now who are looking for people who have Asperger's, because they know how good that is to identify and channel out the noise. In the future, there will be positions that say ADHD preferred, because people in ADHD, they do better in business and they do better in sales, for example, because they have short-term memory lapse, so they get over rejection very quickly compared to other people. I'm saying these things because you may find, as Einstein once said, everyone's a genius. But if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will think it's incompetent its whole life. We just have to get people plugged into the right way, into the right place. My own story, I started off pre-med. It was a disaster for me. I was a math guy. I was an engineering guy. So I needed to have that form of understanding. So you have to know yourself. But this is where the community can come in and help people. There's one brother here who's a good friend of mine now. He's many of you probably know him. And he's really good. He plays semi-pro soccer. You know what I'm talking about? And so he told me his story, and he came from Pakistan, and he played really good cricket in Pakistan. And when he came from there, nobody plays cricket here. By the way, cricket used to be really big in America. I don't know if you know historically. It used to be huge. But what happened was the British Empire made a political blunder, and they said only former colonies can participate in the World Cup. And then the US got out. And so then that's when baseball took off. Anyways, he said, I went through a couple of sports. Eventually, I landed soccer. But by the time he understood soccer and he became very good at it, it took a couple of years. And so he had passed the age of going pro. He became semi-pro. That's where the community can come and accelerate someone. I'll mention the last thing here. I was in Australia this past Muharram, and I saw this firsthand. Imran Khan has mentioned this numerous times. He said, if you don't believe me in anything, at least believe me in cricket. He said, at least in cricket, he says, I have a triple PhD, right? So he said, look, I saw the best talent of bowlers in the world in Pakistan. That's what he said, right? And he said, but raw talent-wise, it was in Pakistan, his view. But he said, every time Australia would beat us in championships, in the World Cup. And he said, why? And he said that Australia has a system. And when I went to Australia, I saw this firsthand. The government heavily subsidizes cricket. There's only, by the way, there's only 5-6 million people in Australia, all of Australia, small. There's 250 million in Pakistan, right? So you think about the numbers, or versus India, over 1 billion people, right? But Australia competes with them. What happens is, you start at 12, 13, 14, and the cream comes to the top, and by the time they're 16, they select them all for the national team in Australia. So there's a system that brings people up. In Pakistan, there's no system that brings people up. There's raw talent everywhere, that's amazing, but there's no system to capture the talent. Similarly, in our communities, I noticed that there's systems, that certain communities capture their talent and elevate their talent, and there's others that have immense raw talent, but we don't have systems to capture that talent and raise that talent together. That's where the community can come in. When people say, I am successful today because of the community, that's when you'll notice they will be funding the community, their kids will be coming, and you won't have to worry about economics or participation. The problem will solve itself.
Do we have any other question?
Which one?
Which one?
Okay, so that one's called A First-Rate Madness by Dr. Nassim Ghami. And there's a very interesting, so that one is A First-Rate Madness.
I think we're going to take one last question from the sister, and we'll go to the night.
Assalamu alaikum. I had a quick question for you, since you were talking about business and us trying to merge our religion and economics and the mosque and everything. In terms of halal income and economics, I wanted to ask specifically, in light of everything that's happening with Palestine, there are a lot of different Muslim groups or different mosques and stuff that have been taking money from Zionists particularly, or trying to strengthen their ties with them in order to gain the money that they then justify taking by using that money to then further build. Okay. They then justify taking that money by saying that they're using it to then further the mosques or then to provide something for the youth. I know that's something that, at least according to the youth that I talk to, being a youth, that's not something that I'm interested in being a part of. That's something that I don't want to see in our mosques or in any of our programs. But I know a lot of the elders have a habit of telling me that we have to have these ties or we have to take this money, and I thought that that was considered a haram type of income, and that's not something that masajid should be built upon. I was wondering if you could talk about that and why we should or should not normalize any Zionist ties in the mosque.
Excellent, great question. So a couple points on that. Absolutely, I think I would refer you to your scholars and your maraja on that. Azul Sistani is pretty clear on that dynamic. And we are facing a difficult dilemma. One thing that I often mention, again, when people are asking me and others about the political economic agenda, and I'll reiterate that our political economic agenda should be the agenda of the Ahlul Bayt, of the Quran, Rasulullah, and Islam. And that captures all of the justice within us. One thing that we as Muslims need to be careful of is the spotlight effect. Two things. Spotlight effect and the Mona Lisa effect. Both of them will help you. By the way, this will help you in the financial markets too, if you guys are interested. So the spotlight effect is used in physics and in other areas. And what happens is, it actually came from Mullah Nasiruddin. Mullah Nasiruddin is outside, and he's outside of his house in the middle of the night, and he's like looking on the street, and he's like on the ground, patting the ground. And when he's patting the ground, a person passes by, and he says, Mullah Nasiruddin, what are you doing? He said, I'm looking for my keys. He said, oh, okay, let me help you out. And he starts helping him out, looking for the keys, and they're not finding the keys. And he says, hold on a second. Mullah Nasiruddin, where did you drop your keys? He said, oh, I dropped them in my house. He said, well, what are you doing out here? He said, this is where the light is. And so this is called the spotlight effect, that wherever there is light, you go there. But that doesn't mean that's where the problem is solved. I'll give you another example. Anyone seen the Mona Lisa? So I went to Paris, I went to the Louvre, I saw the Mona Lisa, and I asked them, what's the big deal? Why is this so expensive and famous and whatnot? And no one had a good answer. They said it's been stolen and whatnot. And so I went to do some investigation. And I found out there's a phenomenon called the Mona Lisa effect. What's the Mona Lisa effect? The Mona Lisa effect was, does anyone know why it's famous, by the way? What happened was, 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, when the Mona Lisa, it was only known by a handful of people. What ended up happening was, it was stolen. When it was stolen, for 24 hours, nobody knew it was stolen. Like, only a few people knew about it. When it was stolen, eventually the news caught it and said, oh, this famous work by Leonardo da Vinci, it's been stolen. Da Vinci had other works too. It's not the only one he did. Anyways, so they said it's stolen. So 1 month passed, 2 months passed, 1 year passed, 2 years passed. Eventually, the news kept saying the Mona Lisa's still missing. Eventually, what happened was they came forward and said 2 years later they found the Mona Lisa and they put it back in the gallery. When they said that on the news, everyone flocked to come to see the Mona Lisa for the first time. And so this is something called the spotlight effect or the Mona Lisa effect that even in finance is used. When everyone's talking about Tesla or Nvidia stock, their savvy investors go and look and find the bargain deals that no one's talking about. What does that have to do with Palestine and the Middle East? We, as Muslims, should not be so reactionary. We should be proactive. And we should be united. These two things are very important. What I mean by that is what happens, unfortunately, in our communities, we need to raise awareness about the Middle East, no doubt about it. What I'm saying is we end up being selective based on what media in the world is saying. But if we were united and said the same way that there's injustice in the Middle East right now, there's also injustice also in Parachinar. And we're united in our voice against that in Parachinar. In Yemen was being bombed for 5-10 years. Nobody batted an eye because the news wasn't covering it. And it was Muslims bombing it over and over again. What I'm saying here, by the way, is don't misunderstand that I'm saying we shouldn't raise the voice for Palestine. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying we should. But what I'm saying is this requires us to be united together. As Iqbal says in his poetry, "You to Sayyid bhi ho, Mirza bhi ho, Afghan bhi ho, tum sabhi kuch to ho, batao to Musalman bhi ho." He said, you're everything. You're Sayyid in this category, in that category, but are you Muslims? You're not united in that concept. In Islam, before Islam came, there was one thing that was the most important to the Arabs, and that was the tribe. And Islam said, we're going to take the tribe and we're going to expand it. So Salman has a tribe as well, because he didn't have a tribe before. Abu Dhar, everyone has a tribe. So the point that I'm getting at is, to the answer of this, our community leaders should be abiding by Islamic principles. They should not be investing in those. And sometimes you don't even know. I had to divest from certain companies that were very outspokenly pro-Israel. And that's where everyone has to make a decision. Our community leaders are also need to do. And by the way, if you understand it, our Christian friends and other friends, even Jews, and many of them are our comrades in this effort. I often say we're not at odds with any other religion. We're at odds with jahl collectively, ignorance collectively. And if you say this is and you didn't say that, but some people in our communities do, they think it's a Muslim-Jewish thing, you'll miss the whole point. Some of the biggest advocates in favor of Palestine are Jews. Dr. Noam Finkelstein, Dr. Noam Chomsky, and you can go down the list. And so the point that I'm getting at here is there was a pastor in Florida who passed away recently, but I remember, this is not a new story. 2014, 9 years ago, 10 years ago now, I remember I was hosting a rally for Palestine. And what happened was there was a priest who came, who was one of the keynote speakers, and he said his congregation, you know, some of these mega churches that have multiple congregations across the world, he said we were faced with a dilemma, should we divest from Israeli companies? And he said we had to make this at a system level, at a community level decision. And he said we went and we booked tickets for our investment team to all go to the Middle East and see what's going on the ground. And he said when we came back, it was a clear, open, shut case. We pulled all of our money from Israeli companies. So sometimes we have to educate others. Sometimes others educate us. And sometimes we have to educate our own communities. So the point being, yes, the principles by which Islamic centers operate should be Islamic. Otherwise, it's the same thing that I said earlier, Imam Ali Center with Muawiyah politics. And that's what we should not have. Great question or comment.
Inshallah, thank you very much. And I think that was the last question. We just have 5 minutes and some refreshments for you guys over here. With that, I would like to thank Dr. Kirmani for sparing precious time, and I would like to have Muhammad say a few words for word of thanks to all of you attendees, and about what a little bit about what our stance is over all this.
Assalamu alaikum. First and foremost, Dr. Kirmani, as always, a pleasure. Thank you very much for giving us your valuable time. Everyone here, thank you very much for attending this gathering. Hopefully, inshallah, we'll continue to have more of these. The last question or comment which was raised, just to touch on that, ICON itself is a religious organization. It's actually a mosque. And it was formed in 2008. In terms of our views, we are not politically involved in anything, and we truly stand for justice, for humanity, and for Islam. And we do not take any money from any organization. We run on donations. And that's been, our views ever since it was established. And we stand with just how Dr. Kirmani has said, just how the board, the EC, and various other members who are involved, that what's happening around the world is quite tragic, and it's been going on for many years, and we support those who are being oppressed, and we will never support those who are the oppressors. And so with that, we'll continue to do that. With that being said, once again, Dr. Kirmani, thank you so much for spending some time with us, and for all of you who attended, I'm, on behalf of ICON, extremely grateful that you're here today, and please enjoy some refreshments, and thank you. Have a good night. Zahir bhai? Yeah.
So let's finish the program with Ziyarat, inshallah. Bar Muhammad wa ali Muhammad salawat.
محمد وعلى محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليك يا نبي الله، السلام عليك يا رسول الله، السلام عليك يا خير خلق الله ورحمة الله وبركاته، السلام عليك يا مولاي أمير المؤمنين علي بن أبي طالب، السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين، السلام عليك يا خديجة الكبرى أم المؤمنين، السلام عليك يا أبا محمد الحسن المجتبى، السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله الحسين الشهيد، السلام عليك يا علي بن الحسين زين العابدين، السلام عليك يا محمد بن علي الباقر، السلام عليك يا جعفر بن محمد الصادق، السلام عليك يا موسى بن جعفر الكاظم، السلام عليك يا علي بن موسى رضا، السلام عليك يا محمد بن علي الجواد، السلام عليك يا علي بن محمد الهادي، السلام عليك يا حسن بن علي العسكري، السلام عليك يا حجة بن الحسن يا صاحب العصر والزمان، السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن، السلام عليك يا إمام الإنس والجان، عجل الله تعالى فرجك، السلام وسأل الله تعالى مخرجك، السلام عليكم أهل البيت النبوة جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم